I've kept this secret for 52 years. What I learned in the mountains of Washington state in 1971 answers the greatest mystery in American criminal history, and it came from a creature that shouldn't exist. My name is Marcus Webb. I'm 78 years old now, and the doctors tell me I've got maybe 6 months left. Pancreatic cancer. The same thing that took my father. But before I go, I need to tell someone what really happened to the man the world knows as D.B. Cooper. The being I came to know as Old Gray didn't just tell me what happened to Dan Cooper. He showed me the man's grave, and what Cooper told him before he died changed everything I thought I knew about that hijacking. The FBI got it wrong. The treasure hunters got it wrong. Everyone got it wrong. Because they were looking for a criminal who escaped. They should have been looking for a dying man who never made it out of those woods alive. I've watched the documentaries. I've read the books. I've seen the amateur investigators with their theories about Cooper living out his days in Mexico or hiding in plain sight in some suburb. They're all chasing ghosts. The real ghost has been buried in a hidden grove in the Gifford Pinchot National Forest for over half a century, and I'm the only living person who knows exactly where. But I need to take you back to the beginning. Back to November 1971, when I was a 26-year-old forest ranger with the United States Forest Service, stationed in the Gifford Pinchot National Forest. Back to when I still believed the world made sense. I came home from Vietnam in 1969, 2 tours with the Army Corps of Engineers, building bridges and roads in places where people were trying to kill us every single day. When I got back stateside, I couldn't stand cities anymore, couldn't stand crowds. The sound of a car backfiring would send me diving for cover. I needed silence. I needed space. I needed to be somewhere the war couldn't follow me. The Forest Service gave me exactly what I needed. They stationed me at a remote fire lookout tower about 40 miles from the nearest town, a little place called Cougar, Washington. The tower sat on a ridge with a view of Mount St. Helens, which was still dormant back then, just a beautiful snow-capped peak that had no idea it would blow itself apart 9 years later. My equipment was simple: a pair of USFS-issued binoculars, a lever-action Marlin 30-30 rifle for bears and mountain lions, leather boots I'd worn so soft they felt like slippers. I drove an olive green 1968 Ford F-250 pickup with a radio that only picked up 2 stations, both of them playing country music I didn't particularly care for. My routine rarely varied: weather observations at dawn and dusk, fire watch during the dry months, trail maintenance when the weather allowed, wildlife surveys that had me hiking miles through some of the most rugged terrain in the Pacific Northwest. I'd play Simon and Garfunkel on my portable cassette player Bridge Over Troubled Water, echoing off the Douglas firs while I worked. The smell of those trees, that particular scent of evergreen and moss and clean mountain air, it was medicine for a soul that desperately needed healing. The nearest human contact was William Sahapton, a Cowlitz tribal elder who lived in a cabin about 15 miles from my tower. We'd share coffee and conversation when I made supply runs, and he taught me things about the forest that weren't in any ranger manual. I considered him a friend, though I didn't have many of those back then. Didn't want many. Then came November 24, 1971, the day a man in a business suit and dark sunglasses boarded Northwest Orient Flight 305 in Portland, Oregon. He handed a note to a flight attendant. He had a bomb in his briefcase. He wanted $200,000 in unmarked $20 bills and 4 parachutes. I heard about it on my radio that night, huddled in my tower while freezing rain lashed the windows. The man, whoever he was, had gotten everything he demanded. He'd released the passengers in Seattle and ordered the crew to fly toward Mexico at low altitude. Somewhere over southwestern Washington, at 8:13 in the evening, he'd lowered the rear stairs of the Boeing 727 and jumped into the storm. The FBI estimated his landing zone at somewhere in a 20-mile radius that included my sector. Suddenly, my quiet world was invaded by search teams. Helicopters thundered overhead. FBI agents in city shoes struggled through underbrush that tore their suits to ribbons. Army units swept through in grid patterns. Local law enforcement brought dogs that went crazy from all the unfamiliar scents. I assisted where I could, guiding search teams through terrain I knew better than anyone. But I told anyone who would listen the same thing: that man is dead. Nobody survives a night jump into those mountains in November. The temperature was below freezing, the wind was howling, the terrain was nothing but old-growth forest, ravines and rivers swollen with rainfall. Even an experienced skydiver with perfect equipment would have struggled. A man jumping with a reserve parachute in complete darkness into a storm had no chance. The search continued for weeks, then scaled back, then became sporadic. No body, no parachute, no money. The FBI was baffled. The media was fascinated. America had a new folk hero, a mysterious hijacker who had beaten the system and vanished into thin air. I went back to my routine, but something had changed in the forest, something I couldn't quite identify at first. It started about 3 weeks after the hijacking, in mid-December. I was doing a standard patrol near the Lewis River drainage when I found the first footprint. It was in a patch of snow, clear and unmistakable. At first I thought it was human, some straggler from the search teams, but the proportions were wrong. It was at least 18 inches long and impossibly wide. The stride length between prints suggested something walking on 2 legs, but covering ground faster than any human could. I told myself the prints had melted and distorted, creating an illusion of size. I was a rational man. I'd been trained to observe and report facts, not to indulge in fantasy. But then I noticed the wildlife. Deer congregating in unusual places, clustering in groups larger than I'd ever seen, as if seeking safety in numbers. Birds going silent when I entered certain areas, that sudden absence of sound that usually meant a predator was near, and a smell I couldn't identify, musky and earthy, not unpleasant, but unlike anything in my experience. I mentioned these observations to William Sahapton during my next supply run. He listened without interrupting, his weathered face unreadable. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "The old ones are moving," he finally said. "Something has disturbed them. Be careful what you look for out there, Marcus. Some truths are not meant for us." I asked him what he meant by the old ones. He shook his head and changed the subject. I pressed and he gave me a look I'd never seen from him before, something between fear and warning. "My people have known them since before memory," he said. "We do not speak of them. We do not seek them. And when they choose to reveal themselves, we do not forget. Some doors once opened cannot be closed." I drove back to my tower telling myself it was superstition, native legends, campfire stories, the kind of folklore that every wilderness area accumulated over centuries. I was a modern man, a veteran, a scientist in my own small way. I didn't believe in monsters. That night something changed my mind. I was in my tower, reading by lantern light, when I heard footsteps. Not the 4-footed rhythm of a bear or deer. 2 feet, heavy, deliberate, circling my tower in the darkness below. I grabbed my rifle and moved to the window, but the moon was hidden by clouds. I couldn't see anything in the blackness beneath the trees. The footsteps continued for maybe 5 minutes, then stopped. I didn't sleep that night. I sat with my rifle across my knees, watching the darkness, jumping at every sound. In the morning I found tracks around the tower, those same impossible footprints circling my home, like something had been studying it, studying me. I told myself it was a bear walking upright the way they sometimes do. I told myself the footprints were just melted and distorted human tracks from the search teams. I told myself William was just an old man who had spent too many years alone in these woods. I was wrong about all of it, and on the night of December 19, 1971, I stopped being able to lie to myself. The snow had been falling for 2 days straight, heavy wet flakes that piled up faster than I could clear them. I was effectively trapped at my tower, cut off from the logging roads that were my lifeline to civilization. The temperature had dropped to 15 below zero, cold enough that the propane heater in my tower struggled to keep the single room above freezing. The wind howled through gaps in the windows, a constant moan that made sleep nearly impossible. I finally drifted off around midnight, exhausted despite my fear. At 2 in the morning, I woke suddenly, not from the wind, which had actually died down. Something else had penetrated my sleep, a sound I'd never heard before. It was a vocalization, deep and resonant, almost like a foghorn mixed with a human moan. It rose and fell, carrying across the snow-covered landscape with a clarity that seemed impossible. It was coming from the tree line, maybe 100 yards from my tower. I grabbed my rifle and moved to the window, my breath fogging the glass. The clouds had parted, and moonlight flooded the clearing around my tower, turning the fresh snow into a glowing white carpet. And there at the edge of the forest stood something that shattered everything I thought I knew about the world. It was massive, at least 8 feet tall, standing on 2 legs like a man, but built like nothing human. In the moonlight, I could see it was covered in dark hair, grayish-brown, thick enough to protect against the brutal cold. Its proportions were wrong for a bear, wrong for any animal I knew. The shoulders were impossibly broad. The arms hung long, almost to its knees, and it was carrying something. Someone. I didn't move. I don't think I could have moved if I'd wanted to. Every survival instinct I'd developed in Vietnam, every bit of training from my years in the forest, all of it simply vanished. I stood there at the window of my tower, my rifle hanging useless at my side, and watched the impossible become real. The creature stood at the edge of the tree line, maybe 60 yards from the base of my tower. It hadn't retreated into the shadows. It wasn't trying to hide. Instead, it seemed to be waiting, watching me watching it, as if gauging whether I was a threat. And in its arms, cradled almost gently despite the massive strength those limbs must have possessed, was the unmistakable form of a human being. My hands were shaking. I told myself it was the cold, but that was a lie. I was terrified in a way I'd never been before, not even when mortars were falling around me in the Mekong Delta. This was different. This was the fear of a man whose entire understanding of reality had just crumbled to dust. The creature made a sound, not a roar, not a growl, but something almost questioning, a deep resonant vocalization that seemed to vibrate in my chest, even at that distance. It was looking directly at me now, and I could see its eyes catching the moonlight, reflecting back a greenish gold glow that was utterly unlike any animal I'd ever encountered. I made a decision in that moment. I still don't fully understand why. Maybe it was the fact that the creature wasn't attacking, wasn't threatening. Maybe it was the human form in its arms, clearly in need of help. Maybe it was something deeper, some instinct that recognized this wasn't a monster, but something else entirely, something that deserved a chance. I went down to meet it. The stairs of that fire tower had never seemed so long. Each step felt like I was walking toward my own death, and yet I kept going. I left my rifle at the top. I don't know why I did that either. It just felt wrong to bring it, like I'd be violating some unspoken truce that was forming between us. The cold hit me like a wall when I stepped outside. 15 below zero, wind cutting through my coat like it wasn't there. But I barely noticed. All my attention was focused on the creature at the tree line, which had begun to move toward me the moment I emerged. The smell reached me first. It was musky, earthy, like wet soil and pine needles, and something else I couldn't identify. Underneath that was another scent, one I recognized immediately from my time in Vietnam. Blood, fresh blood, and a lot of it. 20 yards separated us. Then 15. Then 10. The creature stopped, and I stopped with it close enough now to see details I couldn't have imagined from the tower window. Its face was not the face of an ape. There was something almost human in its features, a flatness to the nose, a prominence to the brow, eyes that held unmistakable intelligence. Those eyes were studying me with an intensity that made me feel like I was the one being evaluated, the one being judged. The creature's expression, if I could call it that, seemed almost concerned, almost hopeful. In its arms, the human form stirred weakly. It was a man, middle-aged, from what I could see, his face badly lacerated, his clothing torn and soaked with blood. One of his legs was bent at an angle that made my stomach lurch. A compound fracture, the white of bone visible even in the dim light. He should have been dead. By all rights, he should have been dead days ago. But someone had been caring for him. The wounds were wrapped in strips of bark, secured with what looked like plant fibers. Some kind of poultice had been applied to the worst of the cuts, a greenish paste that smelled of herbs I didn't recognize. Moss had been packed around him for insulation. This wasn't random. This was deliberate medical care, primitive but effective, administered by something that understood the human body needed help to survive. I looked at the creature. The creature looked at me. "Did you do this?" My voice came out as barely a whisper. "Did you help him?" The creature made another sound, softer this time, almost sad. It looked down at the man in its arms, then back at me, And in that moment I understood something that changed my life forever. This being, this impossible being, had been trying to save a human life. It had found this man somewhere in the wilderness, broken and dying, and instead of leaving him to nature's indifference, it had chosen compassion. Slowly, carefully, the creature knelt and laid the man down in the snow. Then it backed away, not fleeing, just creating distance, giving me space to approach. It didn't leave. It watched, waiting to see what I would do. I knelt beside the injured man and began to assess his condition. The leg was bad, the kind of injury that would require surgery to fix properly. His breathing was shallow, his pulse weak and thready. Hypothermia was setting in despite the creature's best efforts. Internal injuries, probably. This man was dying. I searched his pockets, hoping to find identification, something that would tell me who he was, and how he'd ended up in the middle of the wilderness in November. There was no wallet, no ID, no driver's license. What I found instead was money, bundles of it, $20 bills wrapped in rubber bands, stuffed into every pocket he had. Dozens of bills, maybe hundreds, more money than I'd ever seen in one place in my entire life. The realization came slowly at first, then all at once, like a wave crashing over me. 3 weeks ago, the hijacking, the jump, $200,000 in ransom money. The FBI searching these very woods for a man who had vanished into the night. I was kneeling in the snow beside D.B. Cooper. The creature made a questioning sound, and I looked up to meet its eyes. It didn't understand money, didn't understand hijackings or ransoms or the massive manhunt that had consumed the Pacific Northwest for weeks. All it understood was that it had found a dying human and tried to help. I had a radio in my tower. I could call for help, have a helicopter here within hours. The FBI would come, doctors would come. This man might actually survive, but if I made that call, the creature would be exposed. This being that had shown more humanity than most humans I'd known would become a target. Scientists would want to study it. Hunters would want to kill it. The military would want to capture it. Its life, whatever kind of life it had been living in these mountains, would be over. I looked at the dying man. I looked at the creature. I need to take him inside, I said, my voice stronger now, to help him. Will you help me carry him? The creature tilted its head, processing my words. Then it made a sound that I could only interpret as agreement, and moved forward. Together, human and creature, we lifted D.B. Cooper from the snow and carried him toward the fire tower. The creature didn't follow us up the stairs. It seemed to understand that the tower was my space, my den, and it waited below while I struggled to get the injured man inside. But it didn't leave. When I looked out the window after getting Cooper settled on my cot, wrapped in every blanket I owned, the creature was still there, a massive dark shape against the white snow, watching. I did what I could. I cleaned his wounds, splinted his broken leg as best I could manage, tried to warm him slowly to avoid shocking his system. I dripped water into his mouth, talked to him even though he was unconscious, tried to convince his body that survival was worth the effort. Around 4 in the morning, his eyes opened. They were ordinary eyes, brown and bloodshot and filled with pain. The eyes of a man who had expected to die and was surprised to find himself still breathing. "The big one," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "He saved me." "I know," I said. "Try to rest," but he reached out and grabbed my wrist with surprising strength. "You saw him, the big one. He found me, carried me, kept me warm." His eyes were desperate, pleading. "You have to believe me." "I believe you," I said. "I saw him. He's still outside watching." The man let out a breath that might have been relief. I thought I was hallucinating. I thought I was dying and my mind was showing me angels. A weak laugh that turned into a cough. "Some angel, 8 feet tall and covered in fur. What happened to you?" I asked, though I already knew. His eyes met mine, and I saw the calculation there, the assessment of risk. Then something seemed to break in him, some final resistance crumbling. "I jumped out of a plane," he said. 3 weeks ago, Northwest Orient, Portland to Seattle." I nodded slowly. The hijacking. He closed his eyes. "I never expected to survive. That was the whole point. One final act of defiance, one last middle finger to a world that had taken everything from me. Then a quick death in the cold, and no one would ever know what really happened. But you didn't die. No. His voice was fading, exhaustion pulling him back toward unconsciousness. The big one found me. First night. I was lying in a tree 40 feet up, both legs broken, wishing I could just let go. And then there he was, looking up at me like I was the strangest thing he'd ever seen. He told me the rest over the next 3 days. In fragments, in whispers, in the rambling confessions of a dying man who knew he had nothing left to lose. His name wasn't Dan Cooper, though that's what he'd told the airline. He'd had other names before that, none of them real anymore. What mattered, he said, was why. My wife died of cancer in '69, 42 years old, healthy her whole life, and then 6 months of agony and she was gone. Insurance company fought us on every claim, hospital bills ate through everything we'd saved. And then my daughter, my little girl, she was walking home from school, and a drunk driver jumped the curb. She was 16 years old. He stared at the ceiling of my tower, tears cutting through the grime on his face. After that, nothing mattered. I wanted to die, but I wanted to matter first. Wanted to prove that one man could beat them. The airlines, the FBI, the whole system that had ground me down. One man with nothing left to lose could outsmart them all. He coughed, and I saw blood on his lips. Stupid, he whispered. Should have just driven my car off a cliff. Didn't need to scare those people on the plane. They didn't deserve that. The creature came every night, standing in the snow below my tower, watching. On the second night I went down to meet him again. We stood together in the darkness, two beings from different worlds, united by something neither of us could fully explain. I named him Old Gray that night, for the silver streaks in his fur that caught the moonlight. He seemed to accept the name, or at least he responded when I spoke it. On December 22, 1971, Dan Cooper died in my fire tower. His last words were directed not at me but at the window, at the massive shape he could barely see through his fading vision. Tell him thank you, he whispered. Tell him he was the most human thing I ever met. Then he was gone. I sat with his body until dawn, not knowing what to do, not knowing how to process anything that had happened. When the sun rose, I looked out to find Old Gray still there, still waiting, and I knew what had to be done. I came down from that tower a different man than the one who had climbed up 3 days before. The weight of Dan Cooper's body was nothing compared to the weight of what I now carried in my mind. Old Gray met me at the base, and for a long moment we simply looked at each other. Two beings from different worlds, united by death and by a secret that would bind us together for decades. I didn't need to explain. Somehow, he already knew. That mournful sound he made, low and resonant like wind through a canyon. It was grief. Pure, unmistakable grief. This creature who had spent 3 weeks trying to save a stranger, who had carried a broken man through miles of frozen wilderness, who had used every bit of knowledge his people possessed to keep Dan Cooper alive. He understood that his efforts had failed, and he mourned. Together, we carried Dan into the forest. Old Gray led the way, moving through the snow with a grace that seemed impossible for something his size. I followed, stumbling, struggling, but determined. We walked for what must have been 2 hours, deeper into the wilderness than I had ever ventured, into a part of the forest that felt ancient and untouched. The grove appeared without warning. One moment we were pushing through dense undergrowth, the next we stepped into a cathedral of cedar trees, so old and massive that they blocked out the winter sky entirely. The silence here was absolute, reverential, and in the center of this hidden sanctuary, I saw them, the graves, dozens of them, maybe more. Simple mounds of earth marked with stones, some so weathered by time that they had nearly disappeared back into the forest floor. These weren't recent. Some of these graves had to be hundreds of years old, maybe older. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Old Gray's people had been doing this for centuries, finding lost humans in the wilderness, trying to save them, and when they couldn't, giving them this, a sacred resting place in the heart of the forest. How many trappers and explorers and settlers had disappeared in these mountains over the years? How many had the official record simply written off as lost to the wilderness? Some of them were here, cared for by creatures that humanity refused to believe existed. We buried Dan Cooper in that ancient grove. I dug while Old Gray watched, and when I grew tired he took over, moving earth with hands that could have crushed my skull but instead worked with surprising gentleness. We placed Dan in the ground with the money he had risked everything to steal, all those bundles of $20 bills that had meant so much to him, and now meant nothing at all. His final request honored. When the grave was filled, Old Gray found a large stone and placed it at the head. He touched the stone with both hands and made sounds I didn't understand. A ritual of some kind, words in a language older than any I had ever heard. Then he fell silent and looked at me, waiting. I said the only thing I could think to say. The Lord's Prayer. My grandmother's favorite, the words I had heard 1,000 times growing up in rural Oregon. They felt inadequate for this moment, for this place, for everything that had happened, but they were all I had. When I finished, Old Gray did something that changed everything. He reached out and placed one massive hand on my shoulder. The weight of it was immense, but the touch was gentle, and in that contact, in that simple gesture of connection, I felt something pass between us. Recognition, respect, the beginning of trust. We stood there for a long moment, man and creature, bound together by a dead hijacker and a secret that could never be told. Then Old Gray turned and began walking back through the forest. I followed. There was nothing else to do. The months that followed reshaped my understanding of reality itself. Old Gray and I developed what I can only describe as a friendship, though that word feels too small for what it actually was. We met regularly at a clearing about a mile from my tower. I called it the meeting ground, and slowly, painstakingly, we learned to communicate. His vocalizations were far more complex than I had initially realized. Over time, I identified at least 30 distinct sounds, each with its own consistent meaning. There was a low rumble that meant greeting, a sharp bark that indicated warning, a soft trill that expressed pleasure or approval. He had sounds for food, for danger, for weather, for emotions I didn't have names for in English. This wasn't the random noise-making of an animal, this was language, and he learned from me as well. Within a few months, Old Gray could understand and even attempt to say several English words. My name, Marcus, came out as a deep Marcus that rumbled in his massive chest. Good, danger, home, friend. He struggled with consonants but mastered vowels easily. When he successfully pronounced a new word, his eyes would crinkle in what I swear was a smile. We exchanged gifts like diplomats from foreign nations negotiating a treaty. I brought him things from the human world that fascinated him. Salt was his absolute favorite, and he would dip his fingers into the bag I brought and lick them with obvious pleasure. Fabric scraps intrigued him, especially brightly colored ones, and the harmonica I gave him one spring day became his most prized possession. He couldn't play it properly, of course, but he loved to blow into it and hear the sounds it made. His gifts to me were equally meaningful. Fresh fish from streams I hadn't known existed. Berries and roots that were edible and delicious, traditional foods of his people. And once, an object that took my breath away, a perfect obsidian arrowhead, ancient and beautiful, clearly not made by him or any of his kind. He pressed it into my hand and made a sound that I understood to mean old from before, important. A gift from the past, passed down through generations, now given to me as a symbol of trust. Through these exchanges, through our growing ability to communicate, I learned the truth about Old Gray's people. They called themselves something that sounded like Sasqua-et, a word I couldn't quite pronounce, but that seemed to mean simply the people or the hidden ones. They had lived in these mountains for longer than memory could record. Old Gray gestured toward the peaks of the Cascades and made signs indicating vastness, indicating time beyond counting. His people had been here when the mountains were younger, when the forests were different, when the world was still being made. Their population had once been large. Old Gray indicated thousands with sweeping gestures, but now they numbered perhaps 200, scattered across the entire Cascade Range from British Columbia to Northern California. They lived in family groups, moving with the seasons, communicating across vast distances through vocalizations that could carry for miles. They had customs, ceremonies, a social structure that I was only beginning to understand. Most importantly, they remembered. Old Gray showed me scars on his body, 3 puckered marks on his chest that were unmistakably bullet wounds. Old injuries, decades healed, but still visible beneath his thick hair. He made sounds indicating pain, fear, death. His people had been hunted, shot, killed, by humans with rifles and fear in their hearts. Long ago, many of us, his gestures said. Now few, your kind dangerous. But not all of your kind, he seemed to add, looking at me with those ancient, intelligent eyes. Some understand. Some can be trusted. That was the covenant we formed in those early months. I would protect their secret with my life. They would allow me into their world, share their knowledge, trust me with truths that no other human knew. It was a sacred agreement, and I honored it completely. For 6 years I kept that covenant. 6 years of secret meetings, of learning, of slowly earning a trust that went both ways. Old Gray introduced me to 2 others of his kind, younger males who were curious about the human who had become their elder's friend. I learned their names, or the closest approximations I could manage. They taught me to read the forest the way they did, to see tracks and signs that had been invisible to me before. I brought them news of the human world, warned them when logging crews or hunters were moving into their territory. I became their early warning system, and they became my teachers. They showed me plants that could heal wounds, and plants that could kill. They taught me how to move through the forest without leaving a trace. They shared stories of their people through gesture and sound, histories that stretched back beyond anything I had learned in school. Old Gray became something I don't know how to describe. A friend, a teacher, a fellow soul who understood the weight of loneliness, all of those things and none of them. He was ancient. I estimated him at over 100 years old based on things he showed me, and he carried the wisdom of his long life with a grace that humbled me. In his presence I felt my own trauma from Vietnam begin to heal. The nightmares that had plagued me for years grew less frequent. The silence of the forest no longer felt like emptiness but like peace. Those were good years, sacred years, but nothing good lasts forever. By 1977 everything began to change. The forest itself was different. Logging operations pushed deeper into the wilderness each year. New roads carved through territory that had been untouched since time began. The sound of chainsaws echoed through valleys where Old Gray's people had walked for generations. Their world was shrinking, and there was nothing any of us could do to stop it. Then came the renewed search for D.B. Cooper. In February of that year, a hunter found something that reignited the whole mystery. A scrap of parachute silk, tangled in brush near Ariel, Washington, just 20 miles from where I had buried Dan Cooper 6 years before. The FBI descended on my sector like locusts. Helicopters thundered overhead. Search teams pushed through the forest with dogs and equipment, and behind them came something worse. The Cooper Hunters, they called themselves, a ragtag group of treasure seekers and conspiracy theorists, who had convinced themselves that finding D.B. Cooper's body and the ransom money would make them rich and famous. They were armed, they were reckless, and they were camping right in the heart of Old Gray's territory. I watched them set up their base camp from a ridge, my stomach churning with dread. They had trail cameras, motion sensors, audio recording equipment. They were prepared to document everything they found, and they had no idea what they might actually discover. For 3 weeks, I shadowed them when I could, using every excuse my job provided to keep an eye on their movements. I warned Old Gray to keep his people away, using our meeting ground to communicate the danger. He understood. His people retreated deeper into the wilderness, into places even I had never seen, but they couldn't hide forever. The forest was only so big, and these hunters were persistent. Then Dr. Helen Grayson arrived. She came to my ranger station on a cold March afternoon, her car loaded with research materials and recording equipment. She wasn't interested in D.B. Cooper or his money. She was hunting something far more valuable to her, proof that creatures like Old Gray existed. Helen was brilliant, driven, and utterly convinced that the Pacific Northwest harbored an unknown species of great ape. She had spent 15 years collecting evidence, footprint casts, hair samples, audio recordings, eyewitness testimonies. She had been laughed out of academic conferences, denied grants, called a crackpot and a fraud, but she had never stopped believing. I sat across from her at my small kitchen table, looking at her evidence spread out before me, and felt the ground shifting beneath my feet. Some of her footprint casts could have been made by Old Gray himself. Her audio recordings contained vocalizations I recognized intimately, the warning call, the greeting sound, the low mournful tone that Old Gray made when he was sad. She asked me if I had ever seen anything unusual in my years patrolling the forest, anything that couldn't be explained. I looked into her earnest, hopeful eyes, and I lied. I told her the forest was full of strange sounds and shadows, but I had never encountered anything that science couldn't account for. I think she knew I was holding something back, but she didn't press. She simply left me her contact information and asked me to call if I ever changed my mind. After she left, I sat alone in the darkness of my cabin, wrestling with questions that had no good answers. Helen Grayson wanted to prove that Old Gray's people existed. She wanted to protect them, study them, ensure their survival. Her intentions were good. But I knew what would happen if the world learned the truth. Scientists would come first, then media, then governments. Old Gray's people would become specimens, curiosities, threats to be managed. Their ancient way of life would be destroyed, no matter how good anyone's intentions might be. I had made a promise, a covenant. I intended to keep it, but the universe had other plans. It happened on the night of March 15, 1977. I was asleep in my cabin when the gunshots woke me. 3 shots, rapid fire, echoing through the forest from the direction of the Cooper hunters' camp. I grabbed my rifle and my flashlight and ran toward the sound, my heart pounding with terrible certainty. I knew, even before I got there, that something catastrophic had occurred. The scene I found in that clearing still haunts my dreams, half a century later. 2 of the Cooper hunters stood at the edge of the firelight, their rifles raised, their faces masks of terror and triumph. At their feet lay a body not human but unmistakably one of Old Gray's people, a female, smaller than Old Gray but still massive by human standards. She had been shot 3 times in the chest, and cradled in her dying arms was an infant, a baby of her kind, crying out in sounds that were heartbreakingly similar to a human newborn's wails. The hunters were shouting, arguing about what to do. One wanted to take the bodies as proof. The other was terrified, convinced they had just committed murder. Neither of them noticed me standing in the shadows, my rifle trained on them, my finger trembling on the trigger. I could have killed them both. In that moment, I wanted to. What they had done was unforgivable, shooting a mother who had probably been doing nothing more than trying to protect her child from the strange, loud creatures who had invaded her home. But I didn't pull the trigger. Instead, I stepped into the light and used my authority as a federal ranger to take control of the situation. I told them they had killed a bear, a large, unusual bear, but a bear nonetheless. I told them that shooting wildlife out of season carried serious penalties, and that if they wanted to avoid prosecution, they would pack up their camp and leave my forest immediately. I told them that if they ever spoke of what they thought they had seen, I would personally ensure that they spent years in federal prison for poaching. They believed me. They wanted to believe me. The alternative was too terrifying to accept. By dawn they were gone, their camp abandoned, their equipment left behind in their haste to flee. I buried the female near Dan Cooper's grave, in that hidden grove where Old Gray's people had been laying their dead to rest for centuries. I dug the hole with my bare hands, weeping as I worked, apologizing to her spirit for what my kind had done. The infant survived. I didn't know what to do with her at first. She was so small, so helpless, so utterly dependent on care. I didn't know how to provide. I wrapped her in my jacket and held her close, feeling her tiny heart beating against my chest, and I prayed that Old Gray would find us. He did. He appeared at the edge of the clearing as the sun rose, his massive form silhouetted against the pink and gold of dawn. When he saw what I held in my arms, he made a sound I had never heard before, a keening wail of grief that seemed to shake the very trees around us. The female had been his daughter, the infant was his grandchild. I handed the baby to him with shaking hands, trying to explain through our limited language what had happened. He already knew. His people had been watching from the shadows, unable to intervene, unable to save her. For a long moment, Old Gray stood there, holding his grandchild, looking at me with eyes that contained depths of sorrow I couldn't fathom. I expected anger. I expected him to blame me, to hold me accountable for the actions of my species. Instead, he reached out with one massive hand and touched my face, gently, almost tenderly, and he made a sound that I understood perfectly, even without translation. Thank you. Thank you for trying. Thank you for caring. Thank you for being different. I wept then, standing in that blood-stained clearing, mourning a creature I had never met and an innocence that could never be restored. Old Gray wept with me, his tears falling like rain onto his grandchild's tiny form. When the grief had passed enough for practical matters to intrude, we faced an impossible situation. The Cooper hunters might have fled, but Dr. Helen Grayson was still in the area, still searching, still gathering evidence. The FBI was still combing the forest for any trace of D.B. Cooper, and now there was a dead body buried in a secret grove that could unravel everything if discovered. Old Gray made a decision that broke my heart but saved his people. They would leave. All of them, the entire population of his kind that lived in the southern Cascades. They would travel north, deep into the wilderness of British Columbia, where humans rarely ventured and the old forest still stood untouched. They would disappear from these mountains, perhaps forever. I begged him to stay. I promised to protect them better, to find a way to ensure their safety, but Old Gray was wise in ways I was only beginning to understand. He knew that the world was changing, that the forests were shrinking, that humans were spreading into every corner of the wilderness. There was no safety here anymore. There might never be safety again. We had one final meeting at our usual spot, 3 nights before Old Gray's people began their migration. He came alone, without the infant, without any of his family. Just him and me, 2 beings from different worlds, who had somehow found connection across an impossible divide. He told me the complete story then, not just about Dan Cooper, but about everything, about his people's history, their migrations, their encounters with humans throughout the centuries. He told me about the ones they had saved and the ones they had lost. He told me about their beliefs, their customs, their understanding of the world and the spirits that inhabited it. And he told me about the prophecy. Among his people, there was an ancient teaching passed down through countless generations. It spoke of a time when the world would change so dramatically that the old ways would no longer be possible. When that time came, the teaching said, a bridge would appear, a human who could see them as they truly were, who could carry their story into the future. Old Gray believed I was that bridge. I didn't feel worthy of such a role. I was just a damaged veteran who had stumbled into something extraordinary through pure chance. But Old Gray saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself. He saw the capacity for understanding, for compassion, for keeping faith even when it cost everything. He made me promise to remember, to carry the truth of his people in my heart until the time was right to share it. He didn't know when that time would be. Years, decades, perhaps not in my lifetime at all, but he trusted me to know when the moment arrived. Then he gave me something I have never shown to another living soul until now, a gift that proves everything I have told you is true. It was a pouch made from deer hide, ancient and worn soft by countless hands. Inside was a collection of objects that his people had gathered over centuries, artifacts that documented their long relationship with humans. There were arrowheads and beads, a Spanish coin from the 16th century, a brass button from what might have been a fur trader's coat, and there was something else. Something that connected everything together, a clip-on tie, black, standard business attire from the 1970s. Dan Cooper's tie, the one the FBI had been searching for since the night of the hijacking. The one piece of evidence that could definitively prove the hijacker's identity. Old Gray had kept it all these years, preserved in that pouch along with the other treasures of human contact. He gave it to me as proof, as validation, as a sacred trust. I watched him walk away into the forest that night, his massive form disappearing into the shadows between the ancient trees. I never saw him again. I never saw any of his people again. But I kept my promise. For 52 years, I kept my promise. Now I am dying, and the time for secrets has passed. I am 78 years old, and the cancer in my bones has given me perhaps 3 months to live. I have no family to leave behind, no legacy, except this story and the artifacts that prove its truth. The world needs to know that D.B. Cooper died in those mountains, saved by a creature of impossible compassion, buried with his ransom money in a grave that nature has long since reclaimed. The mystery can finally be closed. But more importantly, the world needs to know that Old Gray's people existed, that they may still exist, somewhere in the vast wilderness of the North, that they are not monsters or myths, but beings of intelligence and emotion, capable of kindness that puts humanity to shame. I have documented everything. I have authenticated what can be authenticated. I have prepared this testimony with the help of researchers I trust to honor the truth, and protect what remains of Old Gray's people. When I die, the pouch and its contents will go to the Smithsonian, along with instructions for how to verify their origin. Scientists will study the tie and confirm it belonged to the hijacker. Anthropologists will examine the other artifacts and recognize their significance. And perhaps, if we are very lucky, someone will begin to look at the wilderness with new eyes. Old Gray called me a bridge. I hope I have been worthy of that name. I hope that by telling this story I have honored both the dying hijacker who found redemption in the arms of a creature he never expected, and the ancient being who showed me that humanity's greatest myths might be its most profound truths. The witness in the woods has finally spoken. May his people find the peace they deserve, in forests where humans have not yet learned to destroy, and may Dan Cooper rest easy, knowing that his secret died with honor, and his story will finally be told. This is Marcus Webb, and this is the truth.